The subtle distortion in the room. Look closer. The next time it happens, you'll be in a routine conversation, a corporate meeting, a dinner party, or listening to a podcast playing in the background. Someone will say something that doesn't sound like anyone else in the room. They aren't louder. They aren't necessarily more polished or rehearsed. They are stranger. In a single breath, they will connect a 17th century essayist to an obscure piece of modern code. They will articulate a truth about your own profession that nobody inside your industry has the courage to say out loud. Then, they go quiet. You'll feel it before you can name it. That person is rare. Not rare like a mythical unicorn, sweet, precious, and harmless, but rare like an unstable compound that doesn't form naturally in this climate. And they are dangerous in a way the room won't realize until much later, when whatever they came to do is already done. The laundering of self-taught. We need to fix a definition. The phrase self-taught has been laundered by modern culture to the point of complete meaninglessness. Today people think being self-taught means watching a handful of YouTube tutorials or reading 3 popular non-fiction books and quoting the jacket copy at a dinner party. That is not self-education. That is information consumption disguised as mastery. The actual definition is much colder, much lonelier, and it explains why this specific kind of person is a statistical anomaly. A genuinely self-taught mind is one that was constructed entirely without a prefabricated kit, the architecture of the textbook. To understand the self-taught mind, you must first look at the institutional alternative. Most formal education does not teach you how to build a cognitive architecture. It hands you a pre-assembled one. The textbook defines what the valid questions are. The professor provides the approved answers. The syllabus dictates the chronological order of importance. The exam tells you exactly what mattered, and the grade tells you whether you successfully complied. In this ecosystem, you don't construct the building of knowledge. You merely walk through a structure someone else built, take photographs of the rooms, and call that an education. Raw cognitive materials. The self-taught mind possesses no such blueprints. By necessity, it is forced to source its own raw materials from the wilderness. It has to decide on its own what the foundational questions are. It must discover its own hidden order among chaotic data points. Crucially, it has to evaluate its own progress without the metric of a letter grade or a teacher's nod. It must figure out which sources are credible and which are noise without an institutional stamp of approval. And it must execute all of this while doubting at every single step whether it is even competent enough to make those calls. Most human minds will not survive that level of unanchored friction. Bandura and the Myth of Giftedness. In 1977, Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura published a foundational paper on a concept he termed self-efficacy, the deeply held internal belief that you can successfully produce the specific outcomes you intend to produce. He expanded this into his seminal 1997 work, Self-Efficacy, the Exercise of Control. His central finding, replicated across thousands of psychological studies since, is deeply uncomfortable for a credential-obsessed society. Self-efficacy is the single strongest predictor of whether a person completes difficult, complex learning. It is vastly more powerful than IQ, more powerful than socioeconomic background, and more powerful than the quality of the institution or the teacher, the uninstalled metric. The most vital caveat of Bandura's work is that self-efficacy cannot be installed by a third party. It cannot be given to you via a diploma or a title. It can only be earned through psychological survival. You build it by enduring repeated cycles of attempting something incredibly difficult, failing completely, adjusting your parameters, and ultimately succeeding without anyone catching you when you fall. Every time a system or a mentor steps in to save a student from the agonizing struggle of confusion, that internal muscle weakens. Every time a person climbs out of the intellectual dark alone, it strengthens. The credentialed system was designed with the best intentions to catch students before they drop. The self-taught person was never caught. They fell, and they got up alone. The Ghost of Cambridge. Consider the historical reality of January 1913. A 25-year-old shipping clerk in Madras, India, named Srinivasa Ramanujan, posted a letter to G. H. Hardy, one of the world's preeminent mathematicians at Trinity College, Cambridge. Inside the envelope were roughly 120 handwritten mathematical theorems. To a classically trained Cambridge academic, the papers looked like the chaotic scrawl of an obsessive amateur. There were no formal proofs attached to many of the claims. The symbols and notations used were bizarre, completely alien to the European mathematical tradition. Hardy initially assumed it was a hoax and nearly threw it into the wastebasket. The innovation of the isolated Hardy went for a walk, returned to his desk and forced himself to study the bizarre equations again. It was then that a terrifying realization set in. Several of the theorems were so wildly unconventional, so profoundly strange, that no academic fraud could have possessed the imagination to invent them. Ramanujan had taught himself advanced mathematics from a single outdated book, G.S. Carr's Synopsis of Pure Mathematics, a dense, dry catalogue of thousands of formulas printed largely without explanations or proofs. Because he was isolated, Ramanujan had to derive the underlying mechanics of the universe from scratch. In doing so, he developed an entirely unique mathematical intuition that the entire elite community of Cambridge had missed, simply because they had never been forced to build the tools themselves. The illusion of explanatory depth. This brings us to the second major asymmetry. The self-taught do not outsource truth. The vast majority of people have never genuinely verified a single core belief they hold. The concepts you believe you understand about history, economics, psychology, or the biological mechanics of your own body were merely handed to you by someone you trusted. They got it from someone they trusted, and so on down an unverified chain of social proximity. In 2002, cognitive scientists Leonid Rosenblatt and Frank Keel published a landmark paper at Yale detailing the illusion of explanatory depth. Most people mistake mere familiarity for actual understanding, epistemic outsourcing. We live in a state where familiarity is constantly dressed up as profound knowledge. It is the default human condition because our brains are fundamentally optimized for social epistemics, not individual verification. We systematically outsource the exhausting work of truth-checking to the tribe, the institution, the trusted expert, or the algorithmic feed. It is cognitively cheap, and it preserves vital energy. The self-taught person has had to break this default biological setting out of pure necessity. Without a syllabus to guarantee they are on the correct path, they are forced to cultivate a habit that the formal system actively atrophies, the relentless practice of running their own manual confirmations. The longshoreman philosopher. Look at the mid-century phenomenon of Eric Hoffer. Hoffer never spent a single day inside a formal classroom. His mother died when he was a young child. His father passed away when he was 18, leaving him completely destitute. He spent the Great Depression working as a migrant farm laborer, eventually spending 25 years as a longshoreman on the San Francisco docks, loading cargo ships by hand. Between manual labor shifts, Hoffer lived inside public libraries, reading indiscriminately without a single professor guiding his taste. In 1951, he published The True Believer, a slim volume mapping the raw psychology of mass movements and fanaticism. Dwight D. Eisenhower kept a copy directly on his desk in the Oval Office. Immunity to the faction. Today, Hoffer's work is recognized as a foundational pillar of social psychology, cited in prestigious university courses he never could have attended. He wrote with an icy, devastating clarity about human behavior that the credentialed sociologists of his era could not match. Why? Because Hoffer had never been trained to flatter the prevailing assumptions of an academic department. He had verified every single insight against the raw reality of the breadlines, the docks, and the political rallies of the 1930s. He had no academic career to protect, no dean to appease, and no faction to defend. His truth was entirely his own, making him something the establishment despises, impossible to capture ideologically. The sealed borders of specialization. The third asymmetry is structural. The self-taught recognize no intellectual borders. Modern universities are strictly organized by departments, and those departments are fiercely guarded. This isn't an explicit conspiracy. It is an organizational hazard. To gain tenure, you must narrow your focus. To publish, you must defend your specific turf. To be respected, You must stay completely in your lane. Consequently, the economist learns to ignore biology. The historian learns to disregard deep psychology. The literary critic and the statistician sit in offices less than 300 feet apart, analyzing the exact same human phenomena using entirely different vocabularies, never speaking to one another. The cartography of the amateur. The self-taught person never signed that treaty of separation. Lacking an academic home, they wander. They follow raw curiosity instead of a structured curriculum. They dive into neuroscience simply because a chemistry book referenced it. They pivot to ancient military strategy because the neuroscience book mentioned stress responses. Consider Heinrich Schliemann, a 19th-century German businessman who made a massive fortune in commodities. In his 40s, he decided to locate the lost city of Troy. The professional archaeologists of his generation treated Homer's Iliad purely as mythological poetry, geographically vague and useless as a real-world guide. The excavation of myth. Schliemann, who had taught himself ancient Greek in his spare time, did something the professionals found preposterous. He treated the poem as a literal map. He took Homer's descriptions of geographical distances, local terrain, and windswept city defenses, walked through northwestern Turkey, and began digging into a massive mound called Hisarlik. He made massive, crude mistakes that a trained classicist would have avoided, and he accidentally damaged valuable historical strata. But he also did what the entire academic discipline had collectively declared impossible. He found Troy. His sophistication lay in his lack of institutional blindness, the metabolism of being wrong. The fourth asymmetry is the most consequential, their relationship with failure. Every formal educational system is designed to make students terrified of being wrong. The failing grade is permanent, recorded forever on an official transcript. The disapproval of the authority figure is visceral. Public wrongness in front of a classroom of your peers is a small psychological trauma repeated thousands of times across your formative years. By age 22, the typical graduate views being wrong as a severe wound to their identity. For the self-taught person, wrongness is functional. When you are alone in a room trying to write code, build an engine, or map an economic reality, there is no audience to mock you. Your errors are punished by reality, not status. The code simply throws an error. The machine refuses to start. Wrongness costs you time, never reputation. This produces an incredibly rapid metabolism for processing errors. The ungovernable locus. The final asymmetry is political. They cannot be governed by conventional means. A person is only controllable if they desperately want something the existing system has the exclusive power to grant or withhold. Status, institutional belonging, corporate promotion, credentialed validation, or social peer approval. The self-taught person severed that dependency loop at the threshold. During the long, invisible years they spent building their mind, the system offered them absolutely nothing. There was no paycheck contingent on their study, no committee cheering them on, and no title waiting at the end. Their locus of evaluation shifted entirely from the external world to the internal mechanics of the skull, smooth glass. When a person whose locus of evaluation is entirely internal walks into a room, the traditional levers of social engineering begin to fail. You cannot threaten them with excommunication from a circle they never desired to join. You cannot bribe them with prestigious credentials they have already evaluated and found empty. You cannot shame them with the disapproval of authorities whose actual competence they have manually tested and found wanting. When institutional figures reach out to grab them, they find no handles, only smooth glass. They are completely unpredictable to an establishment that runs entirely on predictive models. They remain rare not because the knowledge they possess is gated, but because the sheer unmediated loneliness of the acquisition process is something most people cannot bear.